The wind came off the Marrow Deep before dawn and did not stop, and by the middle of the morning the whole of Stonewake smelled of salt and cold iron. Viraya Sarn had lived under that wind her entire life. She knew the sound it made against the cliff stair, the way it thinned when the tide turned, the way it dropped to nothing in the hour before a storm. She knew it the way other people knew their own breathing, which was to say, she never thought about it at all. She thought about it today. Something in it was wrong. Not louder. Not colder. Wrong in the way a familiar voice is wrong when the person speaking has been crying and does not want you to know. She had noticed it at first light while she was grinding the moon ash, and she had noticed it again at mid-morning while she rinsed the stone bowls, and she had told herself both times that she was tired. She was tired. She had not slept properly in 12 nights. The Wright house sat at the seaward end of the keep, a low building of gray stone with a roof that leaked in 3 places and had leaked in those same 3 places for as long as anyone could remember. Nobody important came here. The Wright house was where the ink was made, and ink was not a thing people thought about. In the same way that nobody thinks about the hinges on a door until the door will not open. Viraya was the ink bearer. She had been the ink bearer since she was 17 years old, which meant she had prepared the marking ink for every bonding in the pack of Halvain for the better part of a decade. Nobles, warriors, farriers, the Alpha's own cousins. All of them had stood beneath the arch, with her work drying on their skin. None of them had ever learned her name. She had spent years telling herself that did not trouble her, which was a different thing, and she knew it. She lifted the last bowl from the rinse basin and set it upside down on the drying shelf, and as she did, she heard voices in the passage outside. 2 women. Kitchen staff by the sound of them, carrying something heavy between them and complaining about the stairs. She did not move away from the door. "They are hanging the white cord in the great hall," one of them said. "Both ends." "Both ends" means it is a true reading, my mother says. She says it has not been done with both ends since the old Alpha. The other one grunted. "And the salt girl," the first one said, in a voice she had clearly meant to lower and had not lowered nearly enough. "Somebody ought to tell her to keep out of the way today. She has a habit of standing about." Viraya stood very still with her hand flat against the drying shelf. Salt born. Salt girl. It had followed her since childhood, and it meant only one thing, which was that she had never shifted. Not once. Not at 15, and not at 20. And not ever. There was no wolf under her skin. There was nothing under her skin but her own blood, and in a pack that counted its worth in teeth, that made her something less than a servant. A servant at least had a use that could be named. The voices moved off down the passage, the wind pushed against the shutter, and Viraya went back to the shelf at the rear of the Wright house, where a single covered bowl sat apart from all the others, and she stood over it for a long moment without lifting the cloth. She had prepared that bowl 3 nights ago, blood of the Alpha, drawn clean. Blood of the woman he intended to mark, drawn clean. Moon ash, ground fine. Salt from the deep shelf, which had to be carried up the cliff stair by hand because nothing carried it better. The ink had gone gray, not dark, not the deep and living black that meant the pairing was true, and the moon had no argument with it. Gray, like ash left out in rain, and it had stayed gray through the 2nd night and the 3rd, and gray ink meant one thing only, and every ink-bearer for 400 years had been taught what that thing was. She had said nothing. She had told herself there were reasons. She had counted them in the dark like coins, and counted them again this morning while the wind changed, and not one of them had held. The bell above the great hall began to ring. Viraya set the cloth back over the bowl and lifted the sealed pot she had prepared in its place, the one she had made yesterday, with her own hands and her own quiet decision, and she carried it out into the wind. The hall was already full. The whole of Halvain had come. Elders in their long coats, warriors along the walls, the seaward families in their best wool. All of them turned toward the arch at the far end, where the white cord hung down from the beam with both ends tied. Viraya went the way the ink-bearer always went, along the side wall, head down, invisible. She set the pot on the stand beneath the arch, and she looked up, because she could not help it, because she had never once been able to help it, and across the whole crowded length of that hall, the Alpha King of Halvain looked back at her. Osric Vandrel, a man who had held the Marrowdeep coast against 3 incursions and buried his own father at 19, and never once in public let his face show anything he had not decided in advance to show. He looked at her, and there was nothing behind his eyes at all. Right Warden Galtrey came out from beneath the arch with his hands folded into his sleeves. He was a narrow man of about 60, and he had a way of moving that made people quiet without his ever asking them to. He had read the bonds of Halvain for 30 years. He had read Viraya's mother into her grave, and read the old Alpha into his, and when he lifted his chin, the entire hall stopped breathing at once. "Under the moon," he said, "we are not asked what we want." The old words. Everyone in that room had heard them at some bonding or other, at a cousin's or a neighbor's, and nobody listened to them anymore. Viraya listened. "We are asked only what is true," Galtrey said, "and the reading is given, and the reading is not ours." He turned and held out one hand, and Calantha Duskmere came forward out of the front rank. She was beautiful in a way that had been arranged. There was no other honest word for it. The dark green of her coat had been chosen against the gray of the sea stone, and her hair had been bound in the seaward fashion, because the seaward families were the ones whose votes had needed buying, and every part of her had been placed exactly where it would do the most work. Viraya did not hate her for that. She had watched Calantha Duskmere be assembled for 12 years the way a ship is assembled, plank, by people who intended to sail her somewhere. Calantha stopped beneath the arch and turned her shoulder to the room and drew her collar down. Osric came forward. Viraya had seen him do 100 hard things, and she had never once seen him hesitate before any of them. He did not hesitate now. He dipped 2 fingers into the pot she had set on the stand and drew them out wet and black, and he set them against Calantha Duskmere's bare shoulder and pressed. The hall made a sound, not a cheer. Something lower and older than a cheer, the sound a crowd makes when a thing has been done and cannot be undone. And Viraya, standing at the side wall with her hands folded and her face empty, understood 4 things that nobody else in that room understood. The first was that the ink was gray. Wet. It looked black. Wet. It always looked black. It would dry over the next 3 days, and it would dry the color of ash left out in rain, and every elder in Halvain over the age of 50 would know what that meant, and the ones who did not know would ask, and someone would tell them. The second was that she had made it twice, 3 nights ago and again yesterday, with fresh blood both times, drawn clean both times, and she had ground the second mixing twice over because she had not trusted her own hands. Both bowls had gone gray. The moon had been asked the same question twice, and it had given the same answer twice, and the answer was no. The third was that Right Warden Galtrey knew. He had come to the Right House yesterday evening. He had lifted the cloth off the second bowl and looked into it for a long moment. And then he had set the cloth back down and said, in a voice she had never heard him use before, that ash was only ash and salt was only salt, and there was no need to trouble the king with the moods of a bowl. She had thought at the time that he was frightened of the elders. She understood now that he had not been frightened at all. He had been relieved. And the fourth thing was the one she had been refusing for 12 nights, the one she had walked away from every time it came near her in the dark, and it arrived now while the hall was still making that low sound, and there was nowhere left to walk. When Osric Vandrel's fingers touched Calantha Duskmere's shoulder, something came apart in Verea's chest. It was not grief. She knew grief. She had buried both parents, and she knew exactly what grief felt like, and this was not that. This was a physical thing, low and to the left, a thread going slack that she had not known was drawn tight, and with it went a warmth she had carried since the autumn without ever once being able to name. Her knees gave. She caught herself against the wall with one hand and stayed there, bent, breathing carefully, while 300 people watched the arch and nobody watched her. Nobody except one. Across the hall, beneath the white cord with both ends tied, Right Warden Galtree had turned his head and found her against the wall. He saw her go down. He saw exactly what it meant, and he looked away so fast that his sleeve moved. She did not remember leaving the hall. She remembered the cliff stair, and the wind coming up it hard enough to make her lean, and the tide bell ringing the turn somewhere below her in the dark. She remembered being surprised that it was dark. The bonding had been at midday. The Wright house was cold. She lit the lamp and sat down on the bench where she had sat every evening of her working life, and she looked at the 2 covered bowls on the rear shelf, and she did not move for a long time. Someone knocked. Nobody knocked at the Wright house. In 9 years, nobody had ever knocked. Verea opened the door and found Calantha Duskmere standing in the wind with a lantern in her hand and no attendants anywhere behind her, which was the first strange thing, and a plain wool cloak over the green coat, which was the second. The mark on her shoulder was covered. Of course it was. It would stay covered for 3 days, as every mark did, until the drying was finished and it could be shown. "May I come in?" Calantha said. She did not wait to be answered. She stepped past Verea into the little room and stood there turning the lantern slowly in her hand, looking at the shelves, at the grinding stone, at the sealed pots in their rows. A woman who had been made queen that morning, standing in a leaking shed at the seaward end of her own keep, at night, alone. Verea waited. She expected to be thanked. That was what happened at bondings. The bonded came to the Wright house within the week and thanked the ink-bearer and left something small on the shelf, a coin or a length of cloth, and the ink-bearer said the words "back," and that was the end of it. She had done it 40 times. Calantha did not thank her. Calantha set the lantern down on the bench and turned and asked, in a voice that was perfectly level and perfectly pleasant, "What did you see in the bowl?" The room went very quiet. Not was it beautiful. Not did it go well. Not even is my mark true, which would have been a frightened question but an honest one, and Verea would have known what to do with an honest question. "What did you see in the bowl?" Verea looked at her for what felt like a long while and was probably 3 heartbeats, and she thought, with a clarity that surprised her, "You already know." "Ash and salt," Verea said. "The same as always." Calantha smiled. It was a good smile. It was the smile of a woman who has been taught to smile by people who were paid well to teach her. It went as far as her cheeks and stopped there and came no further, and behind it, Verea saw something move that had no business being in the face of a woman who had won. Then Calantha said that the Seaward families kept a house at Lowbourne, 3 days south along the coast road, and that they had need of someone who understood salt work, and that the position came with a room of her own and a wage and a great deal of quiet, and that it was hers if she wanted it, and that she should not take too long deciding. She picked up the lantern. She went to the door. At the door she stopped, and without turning around she said that it was a hard thing to be the only person in a room who knows something, and that in her experience such people were happier once they had put a little distance between themselves and the room. Then she was gone into the wind. Verea stood in the doorway for a long time after the lantern had disappeared down the stair. Then she went inside and packed. It took less than an hour, which told her something about her life that she would think about later, when she had the room for it. A change of clothes. Her mother's knife. The small grinding stone that had been her mother's before it was hers. Bread from the crock. 14 coins in a cloth. She left the 2 gray bowls exactly where they were. At the door she stopped, the way Calantha had stopped, and she stood there with the wind pulling at her hair and made one last decision, and it was not a kind one, and she knew it, and she made it anyway. She took a length of salt cord from the hook. She tied it in 3 knots, the old way, the way her mother had taught her when she was 6 years old and had not understood what it meant. She hung it on the outside of the right house door, 3 knots in salt cord. A debt owed and not paid. Nobody in Stonewake had used the old signs in 40 years. Nobody would know what it was. Nobody would even see it. Hanging there in the dark on the door of a shed that nobody in Stonewake ever had cause to visit. Nobody except the one man who would. The coast road out of Stonewake ran south along the cliff for 11 miles and then forked, and everyone who used it took the left hand. The left hand went down through the sheep country to Lowbourne, where the Seward families kept their houses and their boats and their money, and where a woman with a trade and a letter of introduction could live comfortably for the rest of her life and never be asked a difficult question. Viraya stood at the fork in the gray light before sunrise with her bundle over her shoulder and looked at it for a while. Then she took the right hand. The right hand went inland across the salt flats toward Undermere, and nobody took the right hand, because Undermere was not a place that people went to. It was a place people ended up. 300 souls on the edge of the drowned ground, half of them born outside Pack Law, and the other half thrown out of it, living off salt pans and eel traps and whatever the tide left behind. Her mother had come from Undermere. That was the only reason Viraya knew the road existed. She walked all that day and most of the next. The flats were flat in a way that made distance meaningless, and the wind came across them without anything to break it, and by the second evening her ears were ringing with it. She passed a drowned church. She passed the bones of a boat sitting upright in a field 2 miles from any water. Twice she passed men who looked at her bundle and then at her face, and then decided against it, and she never once found out why. She did not think about Osric Vandrel. She thought about him constantly, which is a different thing, and she was honest enough with herself by the second night to admit it. She thought about the way he had looked at her across the hall, and how there had been nothing there, and how the nothing had not been cruelty. That was the part she kept returning to. Cruelty she could have carried. Cruelty would have meant she registered. What she had seen in his face was the ordinary blankness of a man looking at a stand, a pot, a wall, the necessary furniture of a room, and it had not cost him anything at all. She thought about the autumn. She stopped herself. She got perhaps 4 steps before she was thinking about the autumn again. On the 3rd morning, she came into Undermere with her boots ruined and salt in her hair, and she went to the only building with a slate roof and asked the woman behind the counter whether there was work for someone who understood salt. The woman looked her over slowly. "You are Nessa Sarn's girl," she said. Viraya had not heard her mother's name spoken aloud in 9 years. She said yes. The woman put down what she was holding, came around the counter, and looked at Viraya's hands, turned them over, looked at the gray staining along the nail beds that 9 years of moon ash puts into a person's fingers and never takes out again. Then she said that there was a room over the drying shed, and that it was cold and it was hers, and that they would talk about the wage when the wage mattered. Viraya went up to the room and set her bundle on the bed and stood in the middle of the floor. It was a good room. It had a window that faced east across the flats, and a door that closed properly, and a bed with a straw tick, and it was, by a considerable margin, the best room she had ever had. She sat down on the edge of the bed. She was still sitting there an hour later when she finally did the thing she had been not doing since the bonding, since the cliff stair, since the fork in the road. She unfastened the top of her shirt and pulled the collar aside and looked down at her own left shoulder in the gray light from the window. At what had been there since the autumn. At what she had never shown to a living soul, not to a healer, not to a friend, not to the man it belonged to, and at what had been fading since midwinter, a little more each week, so slowly that she had been able to pretend about it. And at what had, 3 days ago and 2 days north of here, in the middle of a hall full of people, finally let go. On the third morning the mark should have been shown. That was how it was done. 3 days of drying, and then the bonded pair stood in the yard, and the collar came down, and the pack looked at the work and knew the thing was finished. Osric had watched it done more times than he could count, and had never once thought about any of it. Calantha did not come down to the yard. Right Warden Galtree came instead, and stood on the step with his hands in his sleeves, and explained that the queen's skin had taken the ink badly, which happened sometimes, and that there was inflammation, which happened sometimes, and that the showing would be held over until the swelling had settled. The elders looked at one another. Osric watched them do it. He was standing at the top of the steps with the wind coming up off the water, and he watched the front rank of his own elders turn their heads and find each other's eyes and turn back, and not one of them said a word. He had held this coast for 11 years. He knew what it looked like when a room agreed to something without speaking. That evening he went down to the Wright house. He told himself it was because a fault in the mixing would be there in the second pot for anyone to see, and that would settle the matter and he could stop turning it over. That was true. It was also not the reason, and he knew it before he was halfway down the stair. And he kept walking anyway. The Wright house was dark. He had not been inside it since he was a boy. He remembered it as bigger. There was something hanging on the outside of the door. Osric stopped with his hand raised and looked at it. A length of salt cord, the cheap coarse kind they used on the drying racks, tied in 3 even knots, and hung from the latch where nobody could miss it and where, apparently, everybody had. It meant something. He was certain of that in the way a man is certain about a word in a language he studied badly as a child. 3 knots. It sat just under the surface of his memory and would not come up. He took it down and put it in his coat and pushed the door open. Cold. The lamp cold, the stove cold. Rows of sealed pots labeled in a small square hand. A grinding stone. A bench worn shiny in one place where somebody had sat down in the same spot several thousand times. At the back, 2 covered bowls. Osric lifted the cloths. He looked into them for a long while. The stuff inside was gray as a cold hearth, and he had no idea what that meant, because he was the Alpha King of Halvain, and he had never in his life had a single reason to learn what color ink was supposed to be. He put the cloths back. Then he went up to the kitchens and asked the steward for the ink bearer. The steward said she had gone. Gone where? Osric said. The steward did not know. Nobody had reported it. Nobody reported the ink bearer. Osric stood in the doorway of his own kitchen and asked the question that came next, and it was a simple question, and he expected a simple answer. He asked what her name was. The steward opened his mouth and closed it again. A cook looked up from the board. A boy carrying water stopped where he was. There were 9 people in that kitchen, and Osric watched every single one of them fail in turn to answer him. 80 miles of coast, 4,000 souls. A woman who had prepared the ink for every bonding in his territory since before he took the seat, including his own, 3 days ago, with her own hands, while he stood 20 feet away and looked straight through her. And nobody in his household could tell him her name. Far out across the salt flats that same night, in a cold room over a drying shed, Hesper Bracewell climbed the outside stair with a lamp because she had seen light under the door at an hour when there should not have been light under the door. She found Nessa Sarn's girl sitting on the floor with a stone bowl between her knees. Hesper had run salt in Undermere the whole of her life, and was not a woman who startled. She stood in the doorway and said that if the girl was making ink in her house, she would want to be told, because ink work brought people, and people were the one thing Undermere had successfully avoided. Varaya did not look up. She said that she was not making ink. She said that there was nothing in that bowl but ash and salt, and water off the pans. Nothing of anybody. Nothing in it at all that had the smallest business doing anything whatsoever. Hesper came a step closer and looked into the bowl. In the middle of it, the mixture was black. Not dark. Black. And around the rim, working its way slowly inward, it was going gray. Hesper set the lamp down very carefully on the floor, as though the floor might not hold it. Back in Stonewake, Osric found Right Warden Galtrey in the long gallery, and asked him, without preamble, what 3 knots in salt cord meant. Galtrey said he did not know. He said it easily. He said it pleasantly. He said it without the smallest pause. And Osric Vandrell, who had known that man since he was 6 years old, stood in the gallery and understood with complete clarity that he had just been lied to for the first time in 30 years. Osric did not sleep that night, or the next. He did not send for anyone. That was deliberate. A king asking questions in Halvain was not a quiet act, and whatever this was, he had begun to understand that it went quiet or it did not go at all. So on the 3rd evening he went down to the kitchens himself, at the hour when they were emptying, and he sat on the corner of the scrubbing table like a man with nowhere to be, and he waited until the boy who carried the water came through with the last of the buckets. The boy stopped dead. He was 11 or thereabouts, all wrists and ears, with the permanently startled look of a child who has been told to hurry every day of his life. He put the buckets down. He looked at the door. He looked at the king sitting on the scrubbing table. "What is your name?" Osric said. "Tibbet," said the boy. Osric nodded at the bench across from him, and after a long moment Tibbet sat on the very edge of it, the way you sit on something you expect to be asked to get off. "Tell me about the ink-bearer," Osric said, and the boy, who had no idea that anything at all was at stake, who had not been coached and had nothing to protect, and had never once in his life been asked a question by anyone who mattered, told him. He said her name was Varaya Sarn. He said she gave him bread sometimes when the cook was not looking, and that she never told anyone he took the long way round the yard, and that she knew the names of all the seabirds, including the ones nobody else bothered with. He said she was the only person in the whole keep who had ever asked him what he wanted to be. Osric sat very still and let him talk. Tibbet said she used to stand at the top of the cliff stair at night. Every night, right at the top where the wind was worst, with her arms folded, counting the tide bell. "Counting it," Osric said. The boy nodded. All the way through, from the first ring to the last. He said he had asked her once why, and she had said that if you count something all the way to the end, you find out that it does end, and that this was worth knowing. Osric turned that over and could make nothing of it, and something in his chest turned over with it. She stopped for a while, Tibbet said. Stopped what? Stopped going up. In the autumn she stopped, and the whole winter she never went once, and then, in the spring, she started again. And after that, she went every single night without missing. The kitchen was very quiet. Somewhere behind them a pot cooled and ticked. "Why did she stop in the autumn?" Osric said, and Tibbet looked at him with the flat, mild bafflement of a child being asked something so obvious that he suspects a trick, and said, "Because she was up at the tower with you." Osric did not move. The autumn. He had taken a spear through the shoulder in the 3rd incursion, and it had gone bad, and they had carried him up to the old seaward tower because the tower could be held by 4 men, and the keep could not. and he had been there 5 weeks. He knew that the way he knew the dates on a document. 5 weeks. Fever. And then worse fever. And then a long, slow climb back out of it. He remembered almost none of it. He remembered the ceiling. He remembered being cold in a way that had frightened him. He remembered someone putting salt poultices on his shoulder over and over through the dark, and the sound of a voice reading to him, and the specific and ridiculous fact that at some point he had laughed until the wound tore, and he had never been able to recall what at. He had assumed, for 7 months, that it had been the healers. She was there, Osric said. Every night, Tibbet said. Not the days. The days there were healers. But at night it was only her, all 5 weeks. And she came down in the morning and did her work same as always, and nobody ever said anything about it. Osric felt something happening at the base of his skull, a slow pressure, like a door being leaned on from the other side. I do not remember her, he said. It came out of him before he could decide whether to say it, and it came out badly, and the boy heard exactly how badly and shrank a little on the bench. Then Tibbet frowned. Actually frowned, working at it, wanting to be helpful. And he said that maybe that was why. Why what? Osric said. And the boy said, because you never called her Varea. Not once. The whole 5 weeks. Everyone in the tower heard you say it, and everyone thought it was the fever. You called her something else? The pressure at the base of Osric's skull became a bright white line of pain across both eyes. He heard his own voice from a very long way off, asking the boy what name. Belle, the boy said. You called her Belle. Osric held onto the edge of the scrubbing table with one hand and waited for the white line behind his eyes to pass. And it did not pass. And after a while he stopped waiting for it and simply carried it with him out of the kitchen and up the stairs. Belle. It meant nothing. It meant nothing at all, and it went through him like a hook. Calantha received him in the upper room with the fire lit, and her hair down and her collar buttoned to the throat. She had been expecting him for 2 days. He could see it in how well the room had been arranged. She rose when he came in, and she said his name warmly, and she asked whether he had eaten, and she did all of it beautifully, and none of it touched him at all. Show me the mark, he said. Calantha's face did not change. That was the impressive part. She said that it was still healing and still ugly, and that she would rather he saw it when it was clean, and that a man should not have to look at a raw thing on the woman he had chosen. Chosen, Osric said. He heard it come out of his own mouth, and heard how strange it sounded, and so did she. Show me. She stood there a moment longer. Then she reached up and unfastened the buttons at her throat, one after another, without hurry, and drew the collar down off her shoulder. The mark was the color of ash left out in rain. There was no inflammation. There was no swelling. There was nothing wrong with her skin at all. The work was clean and even and exactly where it should be, and it had dried gray, and it was going to stay gray for the rest of her life. Osric looked at it for a long time. Then he said quietly that she had known this before she came down the stair to the Wright house that night. Calantha buttoned her collar, and then she made her mistake. And it was a small one, and it was enough. She said that it did not matter. She said the elders would accept it because the elders had already accepted it, and that the seaward families had come in, and the coast was quiet, and the incursions had stopped for the first time in 4 years, and that a color in a dish was not worth any of that. She said the whole pack had watched him press his hand to her shoulder, and the whole pack would go on believing what it had watched. And then she said, as though it were nothing, as though she were brushing something off a sleeve, that in any case the only person alive who could tell them different was a salt girl who could not even shift, and that nobody in Halvane had ever listened to her, and nobody ever would. Osric said her name. He did not raise his voice. He had never once needed to raise his voice, and he did not need to now, and Calantha Duskmere took a step back from the fire without seeming to know she had done it. "Verea Sarn," he said. "Her name is Verea Sarn." The silence afterward went on too long, and then Calantha did something he had not expected, which was that she laughed. Not cruelly, almost with pity. "You are standing in your wife's rooms," she said, "6 nights into your bonding, and you are asking about ink." He had no answer for that. That was the worst of it. He stood in the warm room with the fire going and the woman he had marked in front of him, and he searched himself honestly for something to say in his own defense, and there was nothing there. He left. He went down through the sleeping keep to the long gallery, and past it to the room behind it where the readings were kept, and he took the ledger down off the shelf himself because there was nobody he was prepared to ask. The readings of Halvane. Every bond in the pack, 400 years of them, season by season, in the hand of whichever right warden had held the office. Osric turned the pages back through the winter, through the turn of the year, through the harvest, to the autumn. The page was gone, not torn, cut. Cut close to the binding with something small and sharp, by someone who had taken their time, and the 2 pages either side of it had been left perfectly intact so that the ledger still lay flat and nothing showed unless you were looking. Osric ran his thumb along the stub. The cut edge was brown. Paper cuts white and brown slowly, and this one had browned right through, and that meant it had not been done in the last 3 days, or the last 3 weeks, or the last 3 months. It had been done in the autumn, which was 6 months before he had announced any bonding at all. 6 months before Calantha Duskmere's name had been spoken in front of a single elder. 6 months before he had made, or believed he had made, any choice whatsoever. Somebody had cut that page out of his ledger before he had even begun. He rode up to the seaward tower alone at first light. It stood on the headland a mile north of the keep, and it had been empty since the autumn, and it had the particular smell that empty stone gets when the sea is close, and nobody has opened a window in 7 months. Osric had not been back. He had told himself there was no reason to go back. He understood, climbing the stair, that this had been a lie of a kind he had been telling himself for most of a year, without ever once catching himself at it. The upper room was as they had left it. A bed frame with no tick on it, a stool, a cold hearth with the ash still in it. The window in the seaward wall with its deep stone sill, and the gray light coming in flat off the water. He stood in the middle of the floor and waited for something to happen. Nothing happened. He had half expected the room to give him back what the boy had taken out of him. It did not. It was only a room. He had lain in it for 5 weeks and very nearly died in it, and it had absolutely nothing to say to him about any of it. Osric went and sat on the stool with his elbows on his knees. That was when he saw the sill. From the bed, the deep part of the sill would have been at eye level. From anywhere else in the room, you would never have looked at it twice. Osric got up and crossed to the window and crouched down and put his face where his face had been for 5 weeks of his life. There were marks cut into the stone, small ones, made with a knife point, patiently, in rows of 5, in the corner where the sill met the wall. He counted them twice to be sure, 30 and 5. 30 and 5 nights, and then a 36th begun, one single short stroke, and never finished. Osric put his thumb on that last unfinished stroke and found that he could not for a moment get his breath properly. Somebody had sat in this room in the dark, night after night, for 5 weeks, and had counted them the way you count something to find out that it ends. And on the 36th night, whatever had happened, they had not come back to finish the mark. He remembered nothing. He had been carried down to the keep on a litter, and he could not tell anyone which day of the week it had been. He stayed crouched at that window a long while. Then, because he was not ready to leave and had run out of other things to do, he began to go over the room properly, the way he would have gone over ground before a fight. The hearth, under the bed frame, the gap behind the door, and the underside of the sill. There was a space beneath it where the stone had been cut away for a shutter bar that had rotted out generations ago, and the space had been filled with something, and the something had been wrapped in oiled cloth and pushed back as far as an arm would reach. Osric worked it out with 2 fingers. It was a pot. A small sealed Right House pot, the same as the ones on the Right House shelves down the hill, closed with wax and string. There was a label on it, written in a small square hand he had seen only once before, 4 days ago, in a cold room by lamplight. 2 names, hers and his. No date, no mark of office, nothing else at all. Just the 2 names, one above the other, in the ordinary handwriting of a woman labeling a jar so she would not forget what was in it. Osric sat down on the floor of the tower with his back against the wall and the pot in both hands, and did not open it for what felt like a very long time. Then he broke the wax. The ink inside had not dried because the wax had held, and it lay in the pot as still and as deep as water in a well at night. It was black. Not dark, not near enough to black to argue about. It was the black that has no bottom to it, the black that generations of right wardens had written about, and that Osric had heard of the way a man hears about a country he will never visit, and he did not need to have studied anything to know exactly what he was looking at. He put 2 fingers into it, the way he had 7 days ago in front of 300 people. And the salt came up out of the pot into the cold air of that room. Salt and moon ash, and something under it, faint. The smell of a poultice being warmed over a fire at 2 in the morning. And the door at the back of Osric Vandrel's skull, which had been leaned on since that night in the kitchen, came off its hinges. It did not come back as a story. It came back the way weather comes back, all at once and from every direction. The first night, Osric on his back in the dark, with his shoulder packed and burning and 4 men holding the stair below, certain in the flat animal way of the badly wounded that he was going to die in this room, and furious about it, and unable to say so because his mouth would not work properly. And a woman coming up the stair with a lamp and a basin, who was not a healer, and who did not bow. He remembered that. Of everything, he remembered that first. She had not bowed. She had come in and looked at him the way a person looks at a leaking roof, and she had said that the healers had packed the wound wrong, and that she was going to take it out and do it again, and that it was going to hurt a great deal, and she was sorry about that, but not sorry enough to leave it. He remembered the second week, when the fever turned and he began to talk. Nonsense, most of it. He remembered being ashamed even at the time, and being unable to stop, and how she had never once told him to rest, which was what everyone else said, and which meant, be quiet. He remembered asking her, at some hour of some night, what she did when she was not up here. She said she made the ink. For what? He said. For everyone, she said, and then, after a moment, for everyone except me. He remembered the third week, and the reading. She had found a book in the tower, a bad one, a chronicle of the coast written by somebody with no ear at all, and she had read it aloud to him because there was nothing else, and because he could not sleep. And at some point she had begun reading it in the voice of the man who had written it, pompous and damp, and Osric had laughed until the wound tore and bled through the packing, and she had had to do the whole thing over again in the middle of the night, furious and still laughing. That was what he had never been able to remember laughing at. 7 months of not being able to remember, and it was that. He remembered the bell. Every night she stood at the window with her arms folded while the tide bell rang down in the harbor, and she counted it under her breath, all the way through, and one night he had asked her why, and she had told him the same thing she had told a water boy in a kitchen. If you count a thing all the way to the end, you find out that it ends. And Osric had said, from the bed, in the dark, that he was going to call her Belle. She had told him not to be ridiculous. He had called her Belle for the next 3 weeks. He remembered the 35th night. The fever broke that night. He came up out of it clean and cold and clear, the way you come up out of deep water. And the room was sharper than it had been in a month, and she was asleep sitting up on the stool with her chin on her chest and the lamp guttering beside her. He had lain there and looked at her and understood, with the whole of himself and without any part of it arguing, what she was. She woke. She saw his face and knew the fever had broken before he said a word, and she smiled. And it was not a smile that had been taught to her by anybody, and it went all the way through. And then it stopped. Because she had put her hand up to her own shoulder, under the collar, the way you touch a place that has begun to ache, and her face had emptied. He remembered getting off that bed for the first time in 5 weeks. He remembered the floor being further away than he expected. He remembered her turning her shoulder into the lamplight and the collar coming down. The mark was forming under her skin. No ink, no arch, no cord, no right warden, no witnesses. Nothing but a woman standing in a tower at 3 a.m. with a mark rising on her shoulder, the way frost rises on a window, black and deep and unmistakable, and already, in the first hour of its life, more true than anything Osric Vandrel had ever seen. The moon had marked her without being asked. He remembered what he said. It was not eloquent. He said her name, her real one, for the only time in 5 weeks, and there was nobody else awake in that tower to hear him do it. And he remembered sending down the hill at first light for the right warden. Galtrey had come up. Galtrey had stood in this room, on this floor, and had looked at the mark on that woman's shoulder for a long, long moment with his hands inside his sleeves. And then, Right Warden Galtrey had turned to his king and said, kindly, patiently, in the voice of a man who has seen many fevers and knows what they do, that there was nothing on the girl's shoulder at all, that the fever was not finished, that His Majesty should lie down. Osric had lain down. He had lain down, because a man 5 weeks in a fever bed does not trust his own eyes over the word of the Right Warden who read his father into the ground, and because he was so tired, and because it was easier, and because on the 36th night the fever had come back and taken the whole of it away from him. And she had gone down the stair that morning and never come back up to finish the mark on the sill. Osric sat on the floor of the tower with black ink on his fingers and put his head back against the stone. 7 months. She had carried a true mark on her body for 7 months, in a keep where a wolfless woman was furniture, with the only man who had seen it unable to remember her name. And every night since the turn of the season, at the top of the cliff stair in the wind, she had stood and counted the bell all the way to the end. He sent for Galtrey at midnight and received him in the reading room with the ledger open on the table. The Right Warden came in, the way he always came in, unhurried, hands in his sleeves, and he saw the ledger and he saw the ink pot standing beside it with the wax broken and the 2 names on the label facing the door, and Osric watched the whole of the man's life arrange itself behind his eyes in about 2 seconds. "Sit down," Osric said. Galtrey sat. Osric did not accuse him of anything. He had thought about it on the ride down from the tower and had decided against it. Instead, he put things on the table, one at a time, and let the silences do the work. The ledger open at the stub, with the brown-cut edge turned toward the lamp, the pot with the 2 names on it, the salt cord with its 3 knots. And then, last, a folded sheet on which Osric had written down, in his own hand, everything an 11-year-old boy who carried water had told him in a kitchen the evening before. Galtrey looked at each of them. He said after a while that a page could go out of a ledger for a dozen honest reasons. Osric waited. He said that ink kept badly and colors could not be trusted and that any ink-bearer would tell him so. Osric waited. He said that he had served 3 alphas of Halvain and that he had never in his life acted for himself. Not once. Not in 30 years. And Osric said quietly, that he believed him. That was what broke it. Not pressure, not the alpha voice, which he never used and did not use now, just the plain statement, from a man he had known since childhood, that he was believed. Galtrey took his hands out of his sleeves and put them on the table and looked at them, and then he told the truth. He had read the bond in the autumn. He had read it at that window with the mark rising in front of him and no possibility of mistaking it. And he had known within the first breath what it was going to cost. A true bond named in Halvain is not a suggestion. It is not a preference. There is no procedure by which a pack refuses one. And the woman standing in that tower was salt-born and wolfless, and had never shifted, and would never shift, and there was not one family on that coast that would have knelt to her. The seaward families were 3 days from breaking away. The incursions were in their 4th year. Galtrey had counted, sitting in that room, what a contested seat would cost in men, and he had put a number on it. And he said the number aloud now in the reading room at midnight, and Osric felt it land in his stomach like cold water. So he had told his king that there was nothing there. He had gone down the hill and cut the page out of the ledger that same afternoon, before the ink on it was properly dry, and he had burned it in his own grate. And he had not felt like a criminal. That was the part Osric could not get past. Galtrey said it without any shame at all. He said he had felt like a man carrying a roof beam. He said he had gone on carrying it every day for 7 months and would have carried it to his grave and considered it the finest thing he ever did. Osric asked him who else knew. Galtrey said the Duskmere house had come to him in the winter. He did not say how they found out. He said only that they had come, and that after that the bonding had assembled itself with a smoothness that nobody in the keep had thought to question, least of all the king. Then Osric asked the last question, and he almost did not ask it, because some part of him had already worked out the shape of the answer. He asked why she had never spoken. For 7 months, a woman with a true mark on her shoulder, in a pack that would have had to kneel to her, and she had gone down that stair every morning and ground moon ash and said nothing to anyone. Galtrey was quiet for a long time. Then he said that he had gone to see her, that same autumn, down to the Wright house, in the evening, with the cut page still warm in the grate at home. He had sat on the bench where she sat, and he had explained it to her, kindly, because he was not a cruel man and never had been. He had explained that if she spoke, the reading would be denied, that the Wright warden would call it fever sight, and the healers would agree, and the elders would follow the Wright warden, because they always had, that she would be called a salt girl who had put her hands on a fevered king and come down the hill with a story, and that if by some chance she was believed, then the seat was contested, and the seaward families went out, and the coast opened, and men who had children died on a beach in the spring for the sake of a mark on a servant's shoulder. He had asked her whether she wanted that, and she had said no. Osric sat very still. He had spent 4 days assembling a conspiracy in his head, and it had come apart in his hands, and what was left underneath was so much worse. Nobody had stolen anything from her. Nobody had needed to. An old man had walked into a cold room and laid the whole weight of a coastline on a woman who had never in her life been given anything, and she had picked it up, and she had carried it in silence for 7 months, and every night since the spring she had gone up to the top of the cliff stair and counted a bell all the way to the end to prove to herself that things end. And in the spring she had stood 20 feet from him and put the pot on the stand and watched him press his hand into another woman's shoulder. Osric put his face in his hands. He had not been deceived. That was the thing. Nobody had needed to deceive him. He had built, over 11 years and with his own 2 hands, a keep in which a woman like that could not be heard. He called the pack for the showing at noon the next day, and the whole of Halvain came, because a showing that has been held over once is the best entertainment a coast like that gets in a year. They filled the yard. Elders in front, seaward families along the wall, warriors on the steps. The kitchen staff crowded in the doorway behind. Tibbet was there with his back against the wall and his eyes very wide. Calantha came out in green. She had understood, from the moment the summons went round, that something had changed, and she had done the only thing left to her, which was to walk out into that yard with her chin up as though the day belonged to her. Osric gave her that much. She was the bravest liar he had ever met. He did not let her speak. He came down the steps himself, and he stood in front of her, and he said, loudly enough for the wall, that the showing would be done properly. Then he reached out and drew her collar down with his own hand. The yard saw it. 400 people saw a mark the color of ash left out in rain, and the sound that went through that yard was the sound of several hundred throats deciding at once not to make a sound. An elder at the front went white. The old ones knew. The young ones turned to the old ones and were told, in whispers that carried, and it moved through the crowd like water finding a crack. Osric let it run. He let it run until the yard was loud, and then he raised one hand and it stopped. He told them the truth. All of it, in order, in plain words, without protecting anyone. That a true bond had been read in this pack in the autumn and had been suppressed. That the reading had been cut out of the ledger of Helvane before the ink was dry and burned in a private grate. That the woman named in it had been threatened with the deaths of their sons if she ever opened her mouth, and had believed it, and had kept silent for 7 months for their sake. That the Duskmere house had learned of it in the winter, and had said nothing, and had gone on with the bonding regardless. And that he, Osric Vandrel, had stood under the arch 8 days ago with gray ink on his fingers, and had noticed nothing whatsoever. Galtrey was brought out. The Right Warden of Helvane did not defend himself. He stood in front of the pack he had served for 30 years, and repeated, more or less, what he had said in the reading room at midnight. And the terrible thing was that some of them agreed with him. Osric watched it happen. Faces in that crowd that softened, that nodded, that thought a wolfless woman was too high a price for a coast. He stripped Galtrey of the office in front of all of them. The staff broken across the knee, the ledger closed. The man walked out of the gate before dark and put on the north road, and no house in Helvane to take him in. And it gave Osric nothing at all. He had expected it to, and it did not. And he understood standing there that it never would. Then Calantha. The bond was void. It had never been a bond. A mark that dries gray as a mark, and nothing more. Ink on skin. No more binding than a name written on a wall, and every elder in that yard knew it now, and every one of them said so. She asked to speak, and he allowed it, because he was not going to be the kind of man who did not. She said that she had loved him since she was 14 years old. It might even have been true. Osric considered it honestly, standing there in the wind, and decided that it probably was, and that it did not weigh anything at all against the other side of the scale, which was a woman who had carried a true mark in silence for 7 months so that his coast could stay quiet. He said that the Duskmere house would keep its lands, because the coast needed them, and because punishing a whole house for what 2 of its people had done was how the whole thing had started. He said that Calantha herself would leave Stonewake by the turn of the tide and would not return in his lifetime. And he said, last, that no part of what had been done to Werea Sarn had required a conspiracy, and that he wanted the pack to understand that clearly before they went home and made a story out of it. She had been invisible in this keep for 9 years, and every single person standing in that yard had helped, including him. Most of all him. Then he went to have his horse saddled. The oldest elder of Helvane followed him to the stable, a woman of 80 and some with a stick, who had been present at his father's bonding and his grandfather's. She asked him what he intended to do. He said he intended to go and find her. And the old woman said, without any unkindness at all, that he should know one thing before he rode, because nobody else in that yard was going to have the courage to tell him. She said a true mark fades when it is refused. She said it fades slowly, over weeks, and that when it has gone, it is gone. She said the moon reads a thing once, it does not read it twice. Undermere in the spring smelled of wet salt and eel smoke, and nobody in it looked up when a man rode in off the flats. That was the first thing. Osric had expected something, a stir, a stillness, the small ripple that had followed him his entire adult life. He got none of it. 2 women went on turning salt in a pan. A dog crossed the road in front of his horse and did not hurry. He asked a boy where he would find Werewolf, and the boy pointed at the long shed by the drying racks and went back to what he was doing. She was inside, with her sleeves pushed up and her hands gray to the wrist. There were 3 other people in the shed: a young man with a burned face, a woman heavily pregnant, an old man sitting on an upturned crate with his cap in his hands. All 3 of them were waiting, and all 3 of them were waiting for her. And Osric stood in the doorway for a moment and understood that he had walked into somebody's working life. She saw him. She did not drop anything. She did not go pale. She looked at him for the length of a breath, and then she said, to the old man on the crate, that she would be a few minutes, and would he mind stepping outside? The shed emptied. The door stayed open. That was deliberate, and Osric knew it and did not blame her for it. Then he told her everything. He did it standing up, badly, out of order, starting with the boy in the kitchen and going back to the ledger and forward to the tower and the pot under the sill and the sill itself, with its 30 and 5 marks. He told her what Galtry had said in the reading room. He told her what he had done in the yard. He did not soften any part of his own share of it, and he did not ask her for anything at the end, because he had worked out on the flats that asking would be one more thing taken. Werewolf listened with her hands still gray and her arms folded. When he finished, she was quiet a while. Then she said that he had got one part wrong. She said that Galtry had not frightened her. That was the thing people would say afterward, and it was tidier than the truth. And the truth was that the old man had come down to the Wright house and made an argument, and she had listened to it, and she had agreed with it. She said that she was not a girl who had been bullied into silence. She was a woman who had done arithmetic and come out on the wrong side of it, and she had known at the time exactly what she was giving up, and she had given it up anyway, and she would thank him not to take that away from her too by making it somebody else's decision. Osric said that he understood. She said she did not think that he did yet, but that he might. Then she pulled her collar down off her left shoulder and showed him. There was nothing there. Clean skin, a little sun on it, the small white scar of some childhood accident near the joint. That was all. There was no trace whatsoever that anything had ever risen on it in a tower at 3 a.m, while a fevered man watched from a bed and forgot. It faded all winter, she said. She had watched it go a little at a time for months, and there had been nothing whatsoever she could do to stop it, and what was left of it had let go in that hall, with 300 people watching, and not one of them had felt it, but her. Osric stood in the salt shed and made himself look at it, because looking at it was the only honest thing left to do. The moon reads a thing once. He had ridden 2 days across the flats with some part of him still expecting to arrive in time, and he had not been in time, and he had not been in time by 7 months, and there was no version of any of this in which he ever would have been. "I am not going to ask you to come back," he said. "Good," she said. He said that he was going to come here instead. Not as the king. He would come the way anyone came, on the road, without escort, and he would come often, and she was entirely free to send him away every single time, and he would still come, because the one thing he was never going to do again for as long as he lived was fail to look at her. Werewolf did not answer that. She turned around and picked up a stone bowl off the bench and put it into his hands. Then she gave him a measure of moon ash and told him to grind it, and told him he was going to be very bad at it, and told him she had 3 people waiting outside, and no time to be gentle about any of this. Osric Vandrel sat down on an upturned crate in a salt shed at the edge of the drowned ground and ground moon ash for an hour and was, as promised, very bad at it. Once, without any particular ceremony, she reached over and put 2 fingers against the inside of his wrist and turned it 3 degrees and said, "Like that." That was all. He came back 11 days later, and again after that, and through the summer, and into the autumn. There was never another mark. There was never going to be. Whatever the 2 of them built out of the years that followed, they built it by hand, in the ordinary way, without help from anything, and it was smaller than what had been taken from them, and it was theirs, and it was real. And in Stonewake they told the story for a long time afterward, the way packs do, and they always told it the same way and always got it slightly wrong. They said the king had rejected his queen. What had actually happened was that a woman nobody could name had stood at the side of a hall and watched, and had understood everything, and had walked out into the wind and gone somewhere else. They only worked out what they had lost after she was gone. All of them did. Every single one. And by then, she had already stopped counting the bell. Thank you so much for staying with me all the way to the end of this one. If Varaya and Osric and little Tibbet found their way under your skin, the way they found their way under mine, then leave a like before you go. And subscribe if you have not already. And turn your notifications on, so the next story finds you. I would love to know one thing. Varaya counted the tide bell every night to remind herself that things end. What is the small thing you count, or hold on to, when a night gets long? Tell me in the comments, and tell me where in the world you are listening from, because I read every single one of these and it still amazes me how far this little story family reaches. Until the next one, be gentle with yourselves, and may the moon read you true.